Good morning, everybody. Welcome. Want to, thank you for joining the first session. I always look forward to the first session, the first day, because we haven't had the previous night's enjoyment together that we all have. So everybody's here bright and early, and very grateful to have you spend time with us. So we were putting the agenda together for the conference. I'll introduce myself first. I'm Robert Booker. I'm the Chief Strategy Officer at High Trust. Spent a long time on your side of the table as a CISO Fortune 10 company, and retired about a year and a half ago now, and was invited out of retirement. So now I consider myself partially retired with a focus on really how High Trust is looking at the future and the strategy of what we can do to enable and support each of you and the ecosystem of people we support. So it's great to be with you today. So we were thinking about this agenda, and we had the privilege of doing a podcast some weeks ago with Chris Hetner and with Kevin Charest here on the topic of how CISOs think about the interaction with the board of directors. And it's really a conversation about leadership, as we'll get into later today, and how CISOs act as corporate leaders. And because of that, we wanted to reprise that session, really expand it a little bit, get into some more questions and discussion over what we were able to cover in the podcast, and also just heard a lot from you and from the audience and from others about this topic. So just a programming note, I'm not seeing the slides on the front monitors here, so is it possible to get those queued up so I can see where we are, because it's a little hard to get to the sides here. So I think it's a great topic. It's timely. There's a lot of interest currently among board members, directors, the regulators, as we will hear, and others about this topic. So I'd like to start actually introducing our guest and some real luminaries here that are with me on this topic and true leaders in this space. And I'd like to start with Chris Hetner. Chris has such a fascinating background. He's really a kind of a renaissance man around corporate governance and security leadership in terms of how boards and directors look at this. He formerly advised the chair of the Securities and Exchange Commission on cybersecurity, and he is now focused on helping directors through the NACD look at cyber risk and how directors of companies should think about that. So welcome, Chris, and so glad to have you with us today. So.
Glad to be here. Thank you.
Great. And my good friend, Dr. Kevin Charest. I've known Kevin going back, I think, Kevin, to when you were the CISO at Health and Human Services.
I think even before that.
Yeah. I think we'd known each other.
Yeah.
And Kevin's background is so fascinating. He's worked in several major institutions in the health industry. Even prior to that, worked in software governance and software security. And presently serves as the CTO and the CISO of High Trust. But I think the thing that really, in addition to all that great background, Kevin, the thing that I find so fascinating is the work you've done with security leaders, with having been elected in what is a very competitive process with ISC Squared as a member of the ISC Squared board. And for those of you that don't know, ISC Squared is the certifying body for CISSPs and other expertise in security, but it's an organization really focused on skill development and skill certification for cyber professionals and others. And I think, Kevin, you ended that as the chairperson of ISC Squared.
Yep, I outlasted everyone else. Yes, that's right.
Volunteer position, but I'm sure it was a lot of work, and grateful for that. So I thought maybe I would start kind of amplifying on those introductions, gentlemen. So Chris, I think perhaps for the audience, maybe an explanation of how some of the work you've done, like working with the SEC, working with the NACD, those organizations, what their missions are, how they actually look at this problem of cybersecurity given their responsibilities, and what they're trying to do to help advance the art and the science of the work we do. So. And your role maybe with that in a little bit more detail.
Yeah, I appreciate that, Robert, and good morning, everyone. Appreciate the opportunity to partake in this important event. Most of my career was spent on your side of the table, which was largely in the security operations role, mostly supporting financial services, about 2 decades in Wall Street, former global CISO for a very large financial institution, and over the last decade, been squarely focused on cybersecurity, risk governance. I had the opportunity to support and serve for senior advisor to the chair of the SEC. And the last 4 years, I've been squarely focused on corporate governance with the National Association of Corporate Directors. So I've got a bunch of hats that I wear now. Kind of get confused what time of day I'm operating in based on my calendar. But really the mission, I'd say over the last decade, particularly my time with the SEC, is we think about cybersecurity less of a technical issue, more of a business, operational, financial impact issue. And how do we bring that through beyond the technology organization, upstream into the enterprise risk management organization, all the way upstream to the CEO and to the board of directors, arming the C-suite with the right knowledge and the right capability so that they can exercise their governance responsibility, no different than any other enterprise risk, whether it be a financial exposure, access to credit, access to capital, perhaps it's an operational issue. And so at the commission, our focus under the chair's regime about 5 years ago, we issued a 2018 interpretive cybersecurity disclosure guidance. It was guidance that gave corporations that were publicly listed with the SEC the opportunity to disclose the types of cyber risks and incidents that they have. There's a distinction between the two. And based on how important that is to your organization, is it a traditional kind of everyday type of malware event that you just kind of swept away and it didn't cause any impact, or did it have a material disruption such as what we saw over the last few weeks in the gaming industry? So that was really the nature of the disclosure requirement, is provide to the investor community an opportunity to gauge how seriously you take in cybersecurity. Is this top of mind? Is it treated as any other risk? Are you contributing the right amount of budget to suppress that risk? And is the board made aware of these exposures? And then if something does occur, such as a major cyber event, how does that impact the integrity of your company? And if it causes a major interruption that costs you, let's call it, hundreds of millions of dollars, the investment community wants to know about it. So that's really the premise behind the disclosure regime. It's not designed to provide the adversaries with a roadmap in terms of how they exfiltrated your data, how they compromised the end user in terms of deploying ransomware or some type of malicious malware. That's not the intention. The intention is to provide clarity in terms of how these events have caused operational disruption. Again, no different than any other type of interruption that may occur in your enterprise. Fast forward to today, the commission took the rule from guidance to now a hard, fast rule. So this is non-negotiable. This is listed in the Federal Register. It's now enforceable under the guidelines and the actions taken by the SEC. And what I can tell you, just spending time with the boardroom community over the last, I'd say about 60 days, I'm receiving a ton of inquiries from CEO level, board member, CFO. The CISOs are not even in the room. Hey, Chris, what do we do about this new SEC rule? How do we take this to a point where we're treating it no different than any other enterprise risk? And the focus right now, at least what we see in the court systems and particularly around class action suits, is these directors and officers of these organizations are going to be personally held accountable. And we've seen even in some instances the CISO now being held accountable for not taking action or being negligent. There was an investigation through SolarWinds that called out the CISO, including other officers, for not taking action. I don't have any details regarding the investigation, but my sources tell me once this becomes public, it's going to be a scratch the head moment to say, really? Why'd this guy do that, right? So that's the focus in terms of personal liability. So what I advise CEOs, boards, and CISOs is now's the time for radical transparency within the four walls of your company. If you feel like you're underfunded, you're not properly budgeted, you don't have the right support culturally, this needs to be pulled up the flagpole to really articulate that we've got a problem here. we've got some operational issues, and have that candid conversation with the board of directors and the CEO and the C-suite to say, hey, if we don't address these, whether it's foundational, some of this is low-hanging fruit, such as basic technology hygiene issues, but some of it could be a little more advanced, such as, hey, we need to re-architect our network, we're too flat, we need segmentation, we need to deploy to the cloud. There's a lot of complexity in terms of navigating that, but putting that on the table to say, if we want to go from current state to future state, and we want to reduce our operational exposure, here are the investments that we need to make. And I encourage the CISO community to partner with enterprise risk management. So make friends with your general counsel, with your compliance folks, with your CFO, and bring them into the table, bring them into the tent to make sure that you've got a collective messaging, that you're just not, coming from IT, you've got a collective message and support across the enterprise.
Thank you, Chris. That's you said something there that I found interesting, and I love the framing of radical transparency. And so, Kevin, I guess I would just ask you to further introduce yourself. I'd like to explore a little bit kind of your background in actually working with cybersecurity leaders and professionals. So the work you've done with ISC Squared, as well as with the regulator, because I know you collaborated a lot with the industry there.
And I was the regulator of healthcare at one point in time, right?
Yeah, exactly. So I think about that, and just maybe building on Chris's point, but thinking about the leadership dimension of it. So.
Yeah, no, I appreciate it, and I support wholeheartedly what Chris was talking about. Just a little bit more my background. I've been, I jokingly say I haven't slept since 1979. I've been in the protection business since I was a young Marine in '78, and it sort of has never changed. But the challenge we have is that it is a continuous challenge, right? There's no downtime, there's no break, there's no adversarial holidays that I'm aware of, and so this constant vigilance and this understanding that you really need all of the component parts working together. You can't do it in a silo. CISOs very often have been sort of pigeonholed, I think, into a technical realm or an IT focused realm, and the reality is that you need not just the ability to understand what's happening within information security and cybersecurity and incidents and events and all that. You need to understand the entire landscape of your organization. So enterprise risk management, super important. Compliance, super important. Privacy, depending upon your industry, super important. The reality is, if you're not interacting and engaging with all of those elements within your corporation, you're not going to be successful. You can look at, Chris and I were just chit-chatting earlier. I think even back to Equifax and that major meltdown with a 160 million record reveal. I would argue that folks focused on the wrong thing. They focused on the fact that the CISO didn't have a technical degree. She happened to have a music degree. Frankly, some of the best cyber people I've ever worked with may not even have a degree. So I'm not sure that's the right focus. I would have focused more on the lack of internal transparency, leadership challenge, and you talk about accountability. There was a lot of accountability associated with that, from CEO on down. So the stakes are getting higher, the challenges are continuing, and the need, to, really be open and honest. Now, still, I would say there's a challenge for a lot of CISOs out there. They oftentimes work for the CIO. And so I would argue that that's something that I would hope evolves away from that over time, because candidly, the CISO should be a part of the group holding tech accountable and not necessarily be accountable to tech. Because let's face it, if I'm working for the CIO and he's controlling my budget, you have that whole dynamic that can be set up. So the real issue for me is how do we empower CISOs? But leadership is going to be key. This is now an executive position. Leadership is going to have to be taught to those who are coming up through the ranks. I've worked with ISC Squared. We just established, I say we, I'm emeritus, but I'm still obviously engaged. Just established a brand new certification around entry-level folks, right? Getting the new, the new crop, the new folks into the industry and giving them an opportunity. I would argue, and what I've talked to the CEO there is, we need to look, I think, at an executive level CISO type program where it really brings all those other elements into play. Because you proved you can do the work, you proved you can do it at a high level, but can you lead that work? That's just as important as any other element. Oftentimes we take the best widget maker and put them in charge, and we ignore the fact that leadership and collaboration is actually absolutely critical. I had the pleasure of working for Robert Booker for a few years, and I can tell you he was a master at all of those other elements as well, and I learned a lot in that experience. And so you're Fortune 10 for, 10 years plus. Yep. I'd say that's a pretty good accomplishment in and of itself. So the real issue here is understanding the full landscape, not getting myopically focused on one element. So thank you, Robert.
Yeah, so I think kind of moved our attention to the discussion. So just to set the stage for that, because I think it's a great background for what we're doing today, we're just gonna have a kind of a conversation. I've got another slide where I've pulled up excerpts from the rule, Chris, so we'd like to maybe parse that a little bit for people that aren't in the language every day. And I know you're not going to be a lawyer or advisor for us, but let them see the words. And then we want to have some Q&A as well, give you guys a chance to ask questions. I would encourage the hard questions. There may be questions we can't answer, or we may have suspicion of what the answers might be. We can't answer. We can't predict the future. But I think this is a unique opportunity to have a couple of leaders that have been there and done that with this area. And as I heard in the session I was in yesterday, there's really no awkward or stupid question in this area, because we're all trying to learn together as practitioners. So Kevin, just thinking about the role of leadership, and I'll start with you on this, is that you mentioned something at the end of your remarks about security leaders being in the executive now, sitting at the executive level. And I'm actually thinking about this role of company management as well, like being the executive, but also the company's lead executive. So how have you approached that in your role when you've been the senior leader in a company, and how would you counsel leaders to think about their day-to-day engagement as a member of management?
That's a great question. I was my most recent time as CISO prior to High Trust, I was the CISO for Healthcare Service Corporation, one of the large Blue Cross Blue Shield companies. One of those little $40 billion nonprofits. I always thought that was an interesting oxymoron there, but anyway, I'm not a finance guy, but it's a little interesting. But all kidding aside, I remember we had I think it was maybe the second time I was in front of the board, and I had a new gentleman join the board. I won't say much about him, so that I don't reveal necessarily who he is, but one of the first questions, and he was clearly what you see oftentimes on a board, been in my experience, there is often one person with a somewhat technical background, perhaps a former CIO or a former CTO or some other senior leader in tech. And this gentleman asked me a question after I'd gone through sort of where we were going with the year, the funds that we had, what our focus areas were. We really, at that time, we were really zeroing in on identity management and really recognizing as we were heading towards the zero trust world, what that meant and how we were going to have to adjust the way we work. And the question that the gentleman asked me at the end was, are you using Diffie-Hellman? Now, I'm not going to, if you don't know what I'm talking about, I'm sorry. Those of you that do, I know you're laughing out there. So the point is, he zeroed in on one of the most minute, esoteric possible questions he could have asked me, missing the entirety of the subject, to be candid, right? Missing the big picture. As a CISO executive leader, you have to think about the big picture. What you do, the decisions you make, they affect the lives of all the employees, clearly, how they do the work, how do we protect the work. But more importantly, I was kidding around saying I was in the protection business. You know, when you have hundreds of millions of records of people's lives, particularly in healthcare, particularly in finance, large, heavily regulated insurance business, you know, very heavily regulated, tons of information. If you don't take that seriously, that's not what motivates you to recognize you have to think large, right? You have to think about the impact. You know, they'll oftentimes, being very cynical for a moment, someone might say in a meeting, well, gosh, you know, it's going to cost so much money to address these challenges across this wide spectrum. 100% correct. Someone else might say, well, you know, what would it cost if we had a problem? Right? Well, it'll only cost, you know, 30 million, 50 million, whatever you want to estimate. Depends on the size of your organization. But that's the wrong question. Who are we going to impact, and what is it going to cause them? Right? We're in this business, right, to obviously have a business, to make money, to enjoy the lifestyle that we have, but there's such an incredible responsibility that goes with it. And so I would invite all of you to think in those terms. I think the new rule is encouraging that, quite frankly, to really recognize, you know, where we're going, that you have a responsibility to lead, right? Not just accept, but lead. So being willing to challenge the status quo, being willing to put yourself, candidly, a little bit at risk in order to do the right thing, I think is as important as any other element of being a CISO.
Yeah, Kevin, you have a fan in the audience with that
One
comment.
Thank you. I'll get you your gift card after the thing's over.
You know, Kevin, actually, you mentioned something that's interesting that just caused me to remember. It's the conversation among the board when you're with the board. Right. You mentioned one person saying something and then another person saying something. And this is hard to do in your first or second meeting, but creating white space for the leaders to actually have the conversation. You will learn much from observing that conversation. And also other members of management.
That interaction is key.
Yeah, exactly. So, Chris, I think, you know, our audience here is arguably about 50% working with large publicly traded, and the other half of us are people that work in various industries that are either, you know, privately held nonprofits, regional health plans, people of that nature that are not publicly traded. So, some people may be thinking, well, you know, maybe this doesn't apply to me, especially when you think about the regulatory dimension. But I actually go back to the role of the board of directors and corporate directors broadly. So you mentioned being aware of the risk, the enterprise risk dimensions, and maybe elevating the conversation beyond just the cyber risk dimensions. In your experience, you know, working with corporate directors and, you know, hearing what they think are the value they create. You know, how do we think about their role, and both for public but non-publicly traded companies?
Yeah, no, it's a great question, and it's definitely top of mind. And if you all follow me on LinkedIn, I'm extremely vocal about the fact that we need to stop fixating on what I call the rivets or the nuts and bolts of our enterprise. You know, asking whether you have Diffie-Hellman or how many phishing attacks we blocked or how much MFA is deployed is not the right conversation. The conversation that we need to have as a board member and a wholesome board is to think about how cybersecurity threats, me as an enterprise, and I look very different compared to my, you know, others. Perhaps I'm in healthcare, banking, financial services, big pharma, retail, manufacturing. We all have different unique attributes. So bringing that context into the conversation is super critical and foundational. And then the second component is, okay, so what types of threats are going to really introduce material harm? We hear the term materiality, and we immediately think big law firm, right? I actually disagree with that. Materiality, and the way I advise the chair's office on this topic is that we need to take the ultimate accountability for cybersecurity risk management away from the CISO. The CISO is a component. We have to make the accountability to the CEO, the chief financial officer, and the board of directors. Because at the end of the day, if a material cyber event does occur, we need to deflect the attention away from the CISO to say, okay, so what's the so what factor? How is this event going to impact our ability to conduct business, to attract and retain customers, to produce widgets, whatever industry you're in? How does this maintain a level of continuity in terms of your business operations? So that was one area that I believe is going to, kind of ring through as we start to see these rules starting to advance. The disclosures are going to become more apparent. And we at the NACD community, the initial rule, actually, the proposed rule, was proposing that we load up the board of directors with technology folks, CISOs, technologists, and we actually took the position that that's actually not the right approach, because when you have the technologist, and you just alluded to this before, you have the technologist on the board, you have the CTO, the CISO, CIO on the other side of the table, it becomes a very narrow technical conversation about algorithms and zero trust and what types of vendors are we deploying. And what happens is, and I've seen this happen before, the entirety of the board totally checks out. They get on their iPhones, they say, okay, it's time to talk cyber, not my responsibility, not my area of expertise. And that's really represents a broken governance process. The right way to do this is to bring the entirety of the board, into the tent, to think about this more holistically. How does this impact not only, our enterprise exposure, but how does this impact me personally? Again, directors and officers, D&O insurance is going to start to uptick. I work very closely with the insurance industry to think about cyber insurance and now protections around directors and officers' exposure. With this new rule, not only does the commission have the ability to take action, the enforcement division within the commission has ramped up their resources, and there's something called a whistleblower program where you as an employee, or you could be an outside party, to say, hey, something's not right here. I tried to escalate this issue to my CEO. They told me, no, we're not going to show that data to the board because it's going to look bad, poorly on me. Now with this new rule, you have the ability to go directly to the commission to voice this concern, and these whistleblower programs can be very lucrative. They can be in the millions of dollars. We've seen it happen all the time. So what we're going to see is the aperture around transparency to start open up. We're going to see additional investors taking class action suits against particular members of the board, members of management team, and what we're going to see is a shift towards treating this as more of an operational resiliency issue. How does cyber introduce my inability to maintain resiliency as a business? Take the example for MGM. A couple weeks ago, they were down for about 10 days due to a ransomware attack. Took down their entire operations. They were losing about $10 million a day. I suspect this event will cost maybe a couple $100 million when it's all said and done. And the problem that we see in many cases when you have that deep technical conversation, you don't necessarily achieve the stated objective. And the objective is to get the support from the board of directors, from the CFO, to write that check to say, hey, we need another $50 million in order to avoid a $500 million loss. Well, how does that happen? Well, our network is not segmented. We need to bifurcate this segment from this segment, because if this segment, which produces most of our precious dollars and produces revenue, is impacted for a day, 2 days, a week, the tab is going to start rolling in terms of tens of millions of dollars a day. So if we spend $5 million here, we can avoid a potential catastrophe. And having that meaningful conversation with the whole of the board, moving away from the technical deep dive, is really what we're trying to achieve. Now, it's not to say that we can't dive into the weeds, and I advise boards and CISOs, and I'll be brought in to have that deep technical discussion, but that's done usually offline. That's like, okay, so let's look at your network architecture, let's look at maybe root cause associated with a cyber incident, how can we avoid this going forward? Those are deep, separate conversations. And what we do is we advise boards of directors to think about a separate committee within the risk committee that focuses on technology risk, cyber, advanced technologies such as artificial intelligence, supply chain risk, and geopolitical. So you have a nice complementary set of risk domains that you can really deep dive into separately offline, and then bring that forward to the whole of the board to have that more meaningful conversation. But if you follow me on LinkedIn, extremely vocal on how we need to shift this dialogue and bring forward more of that, what I call a compass. Here's where the threats are most likely going to manifest, and here's the impact to your organization. And then, of course, you have to be prepared with, okay, so where do we invest our precious dollars? And so for every dollar spent in this area, I can start reducing a 10 or 20x multiple. But again, it's about being precise. My professional career has taken me the last 4 years since I left government into the insurance markets, into the boardroom community, into the risk transfer markets. We're going to see a shift towards how the insurance, I know we have I think there's a discussion later on about insurance, how the insurance markets are going to basically set the standards around cyber risk management and resiliency. No different than how the insurance markets have set automobile safety measures such as crash avoidance systems, seatbelt standards. So we're going to see more standardization coming out of the risk transfer markets and how those mitigation controls reduce exposure. And what that'll do, it'll take a lot of that burden away from the CISO to start dreaming up these calculations, where all you have to do is point to some actuarial data set, say a company of my size, based on this event type, we're going to see this type of loss range. And it's supported by the risk transfer market. So that keep an eye on that within the next, I'd say 6 to 8 months. It's going to start to ring through, particularly with the new administration and their cyber resiliency agenda, moving more left to boom. Let's get out of the reactionary mode. Let's move more proactive left to boom to make sure that we're deploying capital, we're deploying resources in a way that provides more precision to maintain operational resilience.
Yeah, I think from my perspective, there is, just kind of doubling down on what both of these gentlemen have said. The conversation it's so tempting to go in with scorecards and metrics and to use the term focusing on the rivets, or talking about our algorithms, which I don't think I ever did, thankfully, and with the board. But I think elevating the conversation to what does it mean from an enterprise risk perspective is really valuable. And I think for those of you that serve industries that are publicly traded, I can assure you their boards are asking not just their CISO but their enterprise risk teams about third-party risk, and how do you think about the dependencies that the organization has on the companies that serve you every day. And there are a unfortunately large number of examples now in both all industries. Like you mentioned SolarWinds specifically, Chris, which is a valuable example of a piece of software that had vulnerabilities that were exploited across a wide range of companies. In our healthcare industry, we've had companies that have had significant outages that have impacted, operational outcomes for, large payers, for example. Certainly, we know, and I know people in the audience have experienced the pain of having ransomware events that, caused them to impact delivery of care. So it really is the elevation of the conversation from this is how we think about vulnerabilities, and we think about investments to, mitigate or de-risk this exposure, to what does the system that relies on our technology deliver for the company. And being able to learn, you don't always have to have all of the answers, but to be able to artfully say, we are thinking about, the risk and the dimensions of risk where, this part of our operation may be more exposed than another part. I think the thinking like 3 years ago, 4 years ago was everybody talked about crown jewels. Like, let's protect our crown jewels. Certainly still an important consideration with many companies, but I think most of the operational risks that we have today are about protecting the operational execution of the company. And I would actually compare this to something we all experienced, in the last 3 years, which is COVID. And while these things are dramatically different, and in no way would I want to relate, the tragic loss of life that occurred because of the coronavirus to what we experience every day, from a board perspective, those leaders were regularly and actively discussing how do we operate our enterprise given the fact that we have to keep our employees safe, that we have to serve the markets in a manner that allows us to continue to deliver what we deliver to the market, but not to expose the market or the people we serve, all those considerations. So I've actually found that, for me at least, on reflection, to be an interesting tool to say, if I wasn't talking about, cyber risks, and I was talking about risk to life and health and safety, and I know there's an intersection in healthcare specifically with those two things, but if I just think about how would I have the conversation about this risk dimension impacting, the full spectrum of our employees and our company and how we actually operate and stay in business. So, it really is a stay in business type of consideration. Few companies, but not all companies, have stayed in business successfully after an event. There are smaller or well-known companies that have chosen to take bankruptcy protection after an event and have eventually closed their doors. Our industry in healthcare has been impacted by some of that in the past. So I think it's learning to articulate it in a different way, and really an important way to think about it. And so I know they, the one thing I say, Kevin, I think I'll come back to you, is that, if you think about maybe what is the board wanting from security leaders when they come in the room, how do they want them to show up? What are they really looking for? How do they view that person when they come to talk to them? What are they looking for out of that encounter?
Yeah, it's a bit of a loaded question, I think, because it is somewhat dependent upon how enlightened, I'll use that word,
Sure.
that the board members might be about what their real responsibility, is. I would say, sort of obviously, they're looking for assurance, right? They're looking for competency. They're looking for, hey, this is scary stuff. You got this, or don't you? And can you articulate it in a way that gives them that reassurance, assurance, those elements? So they're certainly looking for that, and what I've seen, particularly, a couple of last few years, where board members, I think, are actually, whether it's programmatically or through education or just a recognition of the landscape, starting to realize that, just being assured that the leader being presented in front of them is quote unquote competent isn't enough.
Yeah.
Right? It's just not. And the fact of the matter is, one person isn't going to save the day. I'm not sure, there's a lot of that mentality out there too, the old little boy in the dike thing, you only got 10 fingers, and so after that you're in real trouble. So recognizing that this thing, that the viewpoint, I think, of board of directors, and I'm the pleasure of doing that a few times, is, okay, I need to know more. I need to know, are you being supported, you, the cyber professional? Are you being supported with resources? Are you being supported with capital? Are you being supported organizationally, culturally, right? How often, well, we don't want to do X because the employees don't like Y, or, whatever. We don't want to disrupt certain elements of our business. It's really right back to what, Chris was talking about. I can spend a few dollars here and save a bucket load of dollars over here, but I have to recognize that. So I think part of that too, Robert, is they're looking for an understanding of, okay, if I do need to do some disruptive things, what should they be and why? And being able to articulate that, and again, not just technically, but culturally. How are you going to mitigate those things? Understand it structurally. what other elements of the business are going to be engaged, and then frankly understand it from a risk landscape, right? The actual data that's coming, the things that are happening in the industry are only going to help strengthen those positions. But you as a leader, whatever title that is, a leader, you've got to be able to present and articulate those things. And I think that's what the board, is expecting. They're really not expecting you to just kind of come in and check, and let the next element of the risk committee, speech kind of go on. Because if they really are paying attention, they're not going to leave that meeting and have a sense of, I can rest. They'll probably be more concerned. So it's really getting much deeper, much less shallow, much less, and by shallow I just mean, hitting the high notes.
Right.
Really weaving it all together, I think, is what they're looking for. And if you're a professional, aspiring to that role or already in that role or supporting that role, I think those are the things you need to be thinking about.
Great, thank you. So let's go to the next slide. I want to spend some time on this rule that's been issued. Chris, you mentioned it. I know you've been quite involved with it. So let's see if we can advance the slides, please. So I think a lot of words. So hang in there with us, because it's many lawyers and regulators are involved in negotiating every word here. But this is not the full rule that was issued. But I just took two parts that I wanted to focus on just for this conversation. Chris will know them well, because I'm sure he's lived in this space and lived in this language for so long. And I'm gonna pause for just a moment. I actually would ask you to read it, because I think it's valuable just to internalize it. And then I'm gonna try to in sort of a friendly way break it down a little bit, and we'll see how we do with that. So give you guys a moment. Excellent. So I think, I looked at it as looking at risk management, at strategy and governance. But Chris, you look like you have something to say about this. So.
Yeah, I'll distill this down to the key points here. The first point is the disclosure of a security incident. So what I advise CISOs and management teams and boards to evaluate the efficacy of your incident response plans. Make sure that you've got your security operations center, your SIM platforms, your incident response functions all tied together to make sure that you're quickly identifying an incident and in a position to determine the materiality. And the materiality of the event is informed based on business, operational, and financial impact analysis. So if you outsource your security operations center to some region throughout the world, make sure that you've got updated procedures. I would advise doing a tabletop exercise, just stress testing the rule. Let's pretend a cyber event occurred. It's a major ransomware event. We've been taken down for a couple of days. It's costing us tens of millions of dollars. And really, test your ability to disclose these events. And then more importantly, make sure that you've got the pivot from your SOC, your IR function, the CISO, but then quickly get this in front of your general counsel, outside counsel, your compliance teams, your risk management teams. So that's the first one. The second piece is really around how do you go about assessing and identifying those risks from cybersecurity threats, and do you have the processes in place, again, updating your incident response procedures. Do you go through a periodic process to make sure that you have an assessment process that identifies risks? It's no different than doing a maturity assessment, but taking it a step further to make sure that you've got some type of independence to evaluate the efficacy of how you're identifying and managing cybersecurity threats. from a risk management standpoint. We used to do this, we had to do this actually on a quarterly basis in banking. Again, this is 20 years ago when I was running point on cybersecurity for a very large bank in New York. But, the regulators, every quarter, they asked us, okay, show us the results of your information security risk assessment process, show us the signatures from the business that signed off on the business impact analysis, because we weren't deriving at that analysis. We relied on our business colleagues to say how important are these assets to us as an organization. So having that process in place to integrate cybersecurity into enterprise risk, periodic risk assessments, whether it's quarterly, half a year, annual basis. And then the other piece here is, okay, so what's the level of integration and touch point between the management team and the board of directors? So it's really about the substance of the conversation and the reporting into the board. Again, I advise move away from high-level scorecards to more substantive types of reports. Keep the technical details in the appendix. Bring forward how cyber threats, based on your current environment, based on the level of investments you have, where you have exposures, where you should deploy investments in capital, and roll this into the board of directors. Now, the board, again, it could be the audit committee, it could be a risk committee, and then it's about the frequency. Are you touching the board annual, quarterly, semi-annual? But it's really about the substance, to be honest with you. It's really how do you articulate cyber in such a way that they understand and they're reciprocating, they're responding, they're engaged, they get it. And I suspect the legal community, they're going to want to see, particularly if there's, let's call it an investigation or some type of enforcement action from the SEC, they're going to want to see meeting minutes, they're going to want to see the metrics that you produced. So if I'm an enforcement guy in the SEC and I'm saying, hey, the board really didn't understand what the hell's going on for the last 2 years. Show us your metrics, show us the meeting minutes, show us the actions. And so I'm going to look for those artifacts and those points of evidence to make sure that the right level of oversight and the actions were taken appropriately. And that again, start now. Start evaluating that process. Go through the process of building the playbooks, building a what I did actually as a CISO when I was at GE Capital. We were designated by the Federal Reserve Bank as a significantly important financial institution. It's called SIFI, as per Dodd-Frank. First thing I did was we developed a board charter. So we defined the role of the board, what committee we rolled into, the role of enterprise risk management, the role of the CISO, the CIO, and all the subcommittees. It was all done in a very comprehensive playbook. So when the regulators came in and say, hey, how do you go about overseeing security in your organization? Well, here it is. We've got a 10-page document, defines roles, responsibilities. But once you have that document, of course, you've got to execute against that and make sure that what you're saying is what you're doing is what you're saying, what you're saying is what you're doing, and executing against. And so that those are really the salient points here of the rule. And quite honestly, there's really nothing shocking here. It's foundational to any sound security program.
Yeah.
And that's really what the commission is trying to achieve.
Good. Thank you, Chris. That was super helpful and very productive. So we will we'll try to distill some of those points down and get those circulated to the post conference notes that we have. So I promised to open it up for 1 or 2 questions. We have about 5 to 7 minutes left, so I wanted to turn it over to you all to see what you're thinking about right now as you think about this space, questions you might have, challenges you're facing where you might want to think about that. So a question here. I see a gentleman about halfway back. We'll get a microphone to you, sir, just a moment, please. And the one over here, okay.
Typically don't need a microphone, being a Marine as well. I have that booming voice that kind of echoes to a room.
Hoorah!
Hoorah.
All right, so talking about the CISO's position in the organization, that is a constant theme challenge, and over the past 3+ years, I was successfully able to, because I'm head of compliance, I'm the compliance officer, I was successfully able to get the CISO out of the CIO and now reporting to chief legal. And the reason being is you can't audit yourself. And now he is now tied and has internal audit that reports to him as well, so that now he can perform all of those tasks that he has to do throughout the organization. The challenge that he's been doing, and maybe this is something that can come to light, is how is it, and have you seen that role where a chief legal is now taking more of that head security role on that top level board?
I would say it's a smaller number than I'd like to see. It's the chief legal officer, maybe some statistics suggest like 5% of companies have the CISO function rolling into legal. It does achieve some level of independence. The challenge there, of course, is attorneys aren't operators, and therefore may not appreciate the depth and breadth of what it takes. But clearly moving it out of the CIO sounded like a sound approach. Some of the banks particularly in the mid-tier to higher level asset group tend to have a chief risk officer that understands operational risk, some technology enough to be dangerous, but really understand the depth and breadth, and the CISO function that rolls into the chief risk officer tends to be very successful.
Right, I would agree, and I've also not too often legal, and I think for the challenges you noted, but I have seen a shift too, as well as towards COO, CRO, COO. Again, the operational understanding, and then oftentimes COO, right, has a very broad brush of responsibilities, and so it's easier to integrate the whole risk management profile across a wide spectrum of services. But either way, again, auditing yourself, if you will, or trying to ensure it can work. Not to say that it can't. Obviously, it does. It's still fairly prolific out there in governance structure. But as we look at it on an ongoing basis, it's not really probably the best possible approach.
Yeah, I think I would characterize it, and then we'll come over here for a question over here. I would characterize it as understanding the corporate culture and where is the risk leader role sit. So I wouldn't say can't work with a CLO. I would ask the question is that CLO really counsel, or is that risk operations, to your point, Chris? And I think that's really the genesis of it. Yeah. So a question over here, please.
Hi, thank you. I'm Josh Siegel. I'm a co-founder of Domain GRC. We work mainly with small to mid-sized private companies that are servicing the healthcare and life sciences industry. What we're trying to understand, and maybe you can interpret a lot of what we were talking about is public company exposure, SEC risks. But what work are you doing with board members of small private companies, right? A lot of cases in healthcare IT, you're looking at a lot of concentration. So the same venture capital groups are investing in many small healthcare IT portfolio companies, or even growth equity, growth capital. And now most of their board members are really just investors. They're the people that led the diligence and decided to invest in the company. They don't necessarily have any industry exposure. They weren't operators. They don't understand cybersecurity, risk, and compliance. They might look at high trust and go like, cool, we need high trust because that's what we need to sell to payers, but they don't necessarily understand what their own responsibility is and their own personal exposure for cybersecurity risk. What role do you see or yourselves playing in the private investor market, educating these types of board members on what kind of patterns they should be observing?
Yeah, I'll take a shot at that. I'm not sure. I'm not sure about the role with the board specifically. I think from an investment perspective, one of the things that you're going to see increasingly from High Trust is a focus on assisting organizations with ongoing maturity and maturity measurement, and not just certification and accreditation and insurance alone, which are very, very important attributes, as you note, but really looking at how organizations can actually start to develop insights out of the high trust assurance work that they're delivering, so they are able to demonstrate with confidence the level of depth and detail that Chris and Kevin have referred to. And I having worked with some of those investment firms personally, venture firms, if you will, I think they are very motivated on their organizations being seen as responsible companies. And I think there is probably a focus more on, corporate sustainability to start, because they're just trying to keep the companies healthy and growing. And I think there's more education to be done there. I think high trust is certainly a voice there. I think others are voices in that discussion as well. I don't know if NACD is doing anything on that, Chris, at all, or
We do have a contingent of privately held boards, and that represents about 25% of our community. We've got about 24,000 board members in our community. With regards to the investment management side of the equation, I assume these companies are investment managers, they're registered investment advisors. That means that they're registered with the Securities Exchange Commission, and the commission is going to finalize a rule this coming fall with regards to investment management. And it's going to be really centered around, how does the investment advisor look at cybersecurity as it pertains to their investment strategy. And if you're a private equity firm, you've got a portfolio of, let's say, a couple hundred companies, to what degree are you overseeing those portfolio companies to make sure that they're not stressed as a result of a cyber event, and that if those events do occur, that it actually devalues the company, right? Particularly on the the acquisition side of the equation, but also on the divestiture side or on the exit. And so more to come on that. And I through the NACD, we actually do a ton of work with the private equity industry, so they're starting to lean in earnest to think about the relationship between their portfolio companies, the performance related to cyber, and actual financial exposure analysis. So I think you're going to see more around this topic.
I know we're just about out of time, but I want to make one quick comment here, and that's also, third-party risk, right? So those companies you're describing, SMB type, companies, they are supplying all these other larger relying party type, companies. And so there's that downward pressure, there's the regulatory pressure, and then I think there's the societal pressure that's all coming to bear on that problem, right? That challenge. They're going to have to evolve, maybe not to the same degree of the rule, but the reality is they're going to have to move in that direction to be successful and sustainable, I think.
Good. Well, with that, folks, we're at time for this session. I want to thank you all for your attention and for joining us on this important topic. Special thanks to Chris and Kevin for bringing their expertise, and Chris for traveling in to spend time with us. Thank you so much. Of course.